Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Professor Chester Cabalza and President of IDSC, for putting together this fantastic conference, which has speakers from nearly every continent. It's 5 a.m. in the morning here, so if I fall asleep during my presentation, please forgive me. What I intend to do today is to try to answer this question, these three questions essentially. The first question I want to address is, are we living in an age of hegemonic transition? Number two, how is the pandemic contributing to change and continuity in the global order? How is US grand strategy impacted by both the geopolitical context as well as ongoing pandemic? All of that in 6.5 minutes. I think that this is my answer to the first question. Are we living in an age of hegemonic transition? I think, yes, we are witnessing the rise of China as a global challenger, but I don't think China is at the moment in a position to challenge US global hegemony. That is not at risk at the moment, because it's not just about replacing the United States, it's about replacing the global liberal order, it is about replacing the international institutions and organizations which are tied to US hegemony, to the US way of doing business, and many of these institutions are indirectly or directly allied with the United States. So even whether you're looking at the World Bank, the IMF, or other international regimes and institutions, they are all implicated by US national interest and the allies of the US, such as Europe, democracies in Asia, such as South Korea and Japan, even other democracies like Australia. So the US has a range of allies, such as nations, as well as ideas. Both multilateralism and democratic ideals are aligned with US hegemony. So replacing US hegemony is not going to be that easy for China. It's not just catching up with the US in military and economic power. It is also replacing these ideas and these institutions in such a way that they align with Chinese interests and Chinese hegemony. So I don't see China replacing the US from a hegemonic perspective in the near future, and by near future I mean the next 4 to 5 decades. China is not a military match. It may be catching up economically, but it does not have the soft power that the US has enjoyed to a large extent. We lost a lot of it during the Trump administration, but I suspect that the US will quickly regain much of the soft power that it lost under Trump's administration. So my first comment is that the US hegemony is today not at risk at all. What does the pandemic do? So, what are the side effects of the pandemic on geopolitics? Number one, the loss of lives in the US and the politics around the pandemic has really deepened the political divide in the country. We have had many days which are equal to a 9/11. 4,000 deaths, 5,000 deaths. The total deaths in the US has reached more than 500,000. So in that sense, the US is literally terribly bruised by the corona pandemic. Secondly, the US has appeared as very incompetent. It's unable to handle this COVID at home as it did the last time when President Obama faced the SARS virus, which the COVID is a variant of it. So there is a tremendous loss of soft power of the US. It appears to be incoherent, incompetent, and unable to lead. And finally, the US has completely abdicated its hegemonic responsibilities to lead the world against a global threat such as the pandemic. So these are some of the major blows that the pandemic has caused to the US presence in the world and on the global stage. And that is something that the US will have to keep in mind as it goes forward. And finally, if you notice that in 2020, the only country which had a positive GDP growth was China with 2%. Every other country's economy has shrunk. So one consequence of the pandemic has been that the economic distance between the US and China has been significantly dented, or the gap has been reduced. So these are some of the side effects of the pandemic on the geopolitical and hegemonic context or contest that is taking place. Now, how can the US respond to these contexts? If you look at those images, you will realize that the United States has a bigger problem at the moment. The big problem is how to recover from the self goal of January 6, 2021. America's democracy was deeply attacked. The capital was under siege. The country is tremendously divided, and this means that the country will be unable to be effective on the international stage. And so increasingly the attention of the president and his staff will be on domestic issues rather than international, which gives an opportunity to China and other powers to challenge US hegemony worldwide. The second thing is that democracy at home is critical to the US way of dominating the world. If US continues to deteriorate on the issue of democracy, then it loses the legitimacy with which it can lecture the world, promote multilateralism, and all other institutions which support US interests globally will be extremely impeded by lack of democracy in the US itself. The US is trying to build support for a contemporary global order at home and abroad. And at the moment, US appearance as an incompetent nation as a result of the COVID, the fact that it's not able to have a peaceful transition of power, all of these are going to make it much more difficult to the United States to be able to more or less impose its will across nations. Our number one goal is to restore our soft power. And that is very important. The US has to be able to get the COVID under control. It has to ensure that in 2022, the elections are clean. There are no contestations about the legitimacy of the elections. And many of the other functions of the government, especially the Congress, continues to take place smoothly. But at the moment, we seem to experience a rebellion at home. And so if the US is not able to get its act together at home, it will not be able to restore its soft power. Hegemony essentially is a much more complex version of what soft power really is. And so to be able to be a hegemonic power, you need to be able to restore, resuscitate, build, and extend your soft power across the continents. The US is losing some competitiveness, especially with regards to green technologies, technologies of the future, 5G, etc. And it's time for the US not only to invest in restoring its democracy at home, but also to restore the competitiveness of some of its sectors in technology in which it is either now on par with China or actually lagging behind. Some people feel that in communications technologies, perhaps China has surpassed the US already. And finally, the US needs to really broaden and deepen its global alliances on every continent. They have been extremely, shall we say, weakened because of Donald Trump's America First policies. But unfortunately, I suspect that some of these policies are also preferred by President Biden's administration, but we will see how it unfolds. And the real test would be how ultimately what posture the US will adopt towards China under Biden. And finally, I think it's time for the US to reinvest in its economic infrastructure at home, economic inequity, all of these things, racial problems, the exposure of the structural inequities that are so deeply embedded in America's politics, which are now visible to everybody in the world. I think the US needs to fix those things. And so the US grand strategy will be to not just recover from the pandemic, but to address these enduring problems at home, the continuous decline of US democracy. On the democracy index, the US is now a flawed democracy, which means there are 25 democracies which are better than the US in the world. So it has to fix that side of it. And it also, even though it is one of the 5 most competitive economies, it still needs to regain its edge in all forms of technologies, not just in military technologies. And I think this is what the US grand strategy is going to shape out in the next. When the US grand strategy does not change, it is an ultimate status quo power. The US has preeminence and it wants to retain that preeminence, but much of it is being dented. And so basically, the US will have to see if it can restore its stature on the global stage. China is not yet a threat, but catching up fast. And with that, I will stop and be happy to answer questions when I'm asked.